The midnight knock came like a fist against fate itself. 3 hard raps on the door of the only lit window for 20 miles in any direction. And Milton Wells, who had not slept well since the war took something from him he could never quite name, was already awake when it happened. He had been sitting at his kitchen table with a tin cup of cold coffee, listening to the wind move through the canyon walls beyond his property, the kind of wind that sounded almost human when it found the right gap in the rock. His ranch sat at the edge of what most people called the Lower Colorado Territory in the year 1873, when the land was still more wild than tamed, when the nearest town of Raydrock was a full 7 miles east, and the nearest neighbor was old Gus Farley, who was mostly deaf and twice as ornery. Milton had 30 head of cattle, a reliable horse named Compass, and a reputation among the sparse community of Raydrock for being a man of few words and unwavering character. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of working cattle and mending fence line, with calloused hands and a face that the sun had carved into something that was not quite handsome in the traditional sense, but was honest in a way that made people trust him. He had a habit of pushing his dark hair back from his forehead when he was thinking, and he had been doing a great deal of thinking that particular October night, sitting with his cold coffee and the sound of the canyon wind. When the knock came, he did not hesitate. That was the truth of it, plain and simple, the kind of truth that defined a man's character more than any speech he could make or deed he could announce. He simply set down the cup, rose from the chair, crossed the rough plank floor, and opened the door. What he found standing on his porch in the blue-black dark was a woman he had never seen before, and behind her, a buckboard wagon sitting awkwardly in the yard with its left rear wheel snapped clean off at the axle. 3 children clung to her, one on each side and one pressed against her back. The smallest one, a girl who could not have been older than 4, had her face buried in the folds of the woman's coat. The other 2, a boy of perhaps 7 and a girl of maybe 9, stared up at Milton with wide eyes that held equal measures of fear and exhausted hope. The woman herself was something else entirely. She was perhaps 28 or 29, though the hardship in her face made it difficult to be certain. Her dark auburn hair had come loose from whatever arrangement she had put it in at the start of what must have been a very long journey, and it fell in wind-tangled waves around her face and shoulders. She was wearing a dark wool coat that was too thin for the October night, and her boots were caked in red clay mud. There was a cut on her cheek, not deep but fresh, probably from a branch or a piece of flying debris when the wheel went. Her eyes, which were a shade of green that Milton would later spend a great deal of time trying to describe and always fail at, were steady and direct despite the exhaustion in them, and that more than anything struck him. She was not looking at him with the pleading helplessness of a person who had given up. She was looking at him with the careful assessment of a person who had learned to judge strangers quickly and accurately, and was doing so now. "My wagon wheel broke about half a mile back," she said, and her voice was low and controlled, a voice that had been keeping itself steady by sheer force of will for what sounded like hours. "I walked my children to your light. I am sorry for the hour. I would not have knocked if I had any other choice." Milton looked at the 3 children. He looked at the broken wagon visible in the yard. He looked at the woman's mud-caked boots and too thin coat and the cut on her cheek. "Come inside," he said. He stepped back and opened the door wider. She did not move immediately. He could see her recalibrating, the way a person does when they have spent so long bracing against the world, refusing to help that they have forgotten what it looks like when it does. "I have 3 children," she said, as if he might not have noticed. "I can see that," Milton said. "Come inside. It is cold." Something in her face shifted then, not breaking exactly, but releasing. She put her hand on the shoulder of the older girl and guided her through the door first, then the boy, then stepped in herself with the smallest girl still attached to her like a barnacle. Milton closed the door against the October wind. His kitchen and main room together were not large, but they were clean and warm, the wood stove throwing good orange heat into the space. He moved immediately to add more wood, then went to the shelf where he kept his staple goods. He had cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans, and he had baked a pan of corn bread 2 days ago that was still wrapped in cloth on the counter. He pulled it out and set it on the table. "Sit down," he said. The older girl, the 9-year-old, pulled out a chair and sat with the careful posture of a child who had been taught manners and was determined to maintain them regardless of circumstance. The boy sat beside her. The woman lifted the smallest child from her hip and settled her into a chair, then remained standing herself, watching Milton with those assessing green eyes. "I am Theodora Callahan," she said. "These are my children. Lily is 9, Thomas is 7, and the little one is me, she is 4. "Milton Wells," he said, without turning from the counter where he was slicing the corn bread. "This is my property. You are welcome to stay the night and we can look at your wagon in the morning." "I do not want to impose," Theodora said. He turned and looked at her directly then, and what he said next was not unkind, but it was firm. "Mrs. Callahan, it is past midnight in the Colorado Territory in October. You have 3 children and a broken wagon. There is nothing between here and Redrock except 7 miles of dark road and whatever has decided to come down from the canyon tonight. You are not imposing. You are being practical." Theodora Callahan looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she pulled out a chair and sat down. The children ate with the contained desperation of young people who had been hungry for several hours and were trying not to show it. Lily ate neatly, cutting her corn bread into pieces with the side of her fork the way a grown woman might. Thomas ate quickly and then looked sideways at the remaining portion on the plate, as if calculating whether it would be rude to ask for more. Me simply clutched her piece in both small hands and ate it with the single-minded focus of a child who had learned not to assume there would be another. Milton made a pot of fresh coffee and also heated some water for a tea made from dried mint leaves he kept on the shelf, because he had always found that hot things helped children settle. He poured the tea for the 3 children and the coffee for himself, and after a moment's hesitation, poured a cup for Theodora as well. She wrapped her hands around it and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and those 2 words carried more freight than most speeches. "Where were you headed?" he asked, sitting down at the far end of the table. "Redrock," she said. "I have a sister there, Margaret Prout. Her husband Henry runs the grain store." Milton nodded. He knew Henry Prout, a decent man, fair in business. "You were coming from where?" "Abilene, Kansas," Theodora said. Her chin came up slightly, anticipating the next question, which was the one everyone always asked. "That is a long way," Milton said, and he did not ask the question that she was expecting, at least not yet. She seemed to notice that. Something in her shoulders settled further. "We have been traveling for 19 days, she said. "My wagon axle has been threatening to give out since before I crossed the New Mexico border. I should have had it seen to in Santa Fe, but I was trying to make time." Me had finished her corn bread and was now leaning against her mother's arm, her eyes already growing heavy. Theodora reached around and smoothed the child's hair with a practiced, unconscious tenderness that Milton noticed, and then pretended he had not. "The wheel cracked when I hit a rut about a mile back," Theodora continued. "I did not see it in the dark. The whole left rear assembly came off at the axle. The wagon is sitting at an angle in your yard. I am afraid some of my goods may have shifted. We can secure it tonight and look at the axle in the morning," Milton said. "I have timber and some iron plate in the barn. It is not the same as a proper wheelwright, but it will get you to Redrock." Theodora was quiet for a moment. "You are very practical," she said. "It is late," he said. "Practicality seems appropriate." A ghost of something crossed her face, something that might, under different circumstances and with more sleep behind it, have been a smile. He gave the children his bedroom, which was through a door off the main room, and had a proper bed with a quilt his mother had made, broad enough for all 3 of them to lie across it. Theodora helped settle them, and within minutes of her pulling the quilt up, all 3 were asleep with the absolute totality that belongs only to exhausted children. She came back out to the main room and found Milton making a bed for himself out of folded horse blankets near the stove. "You cannot sleep on the floor," she said. "I have slept in worse places," he said, including one occasion involving a creek bed and a family of raccoons that I would prefer not to revisit. She stared at him. "Was that a joke?" "A mild one," he said. She sat down in the chair nearest the stove and looked at the fire through the grate. The cut on her cheek had dried. He brought her a damp cloth without being asked, and she pressed it to her face and then looked at him over it. "My husband died 14 months ago," she said. "His name was Patrick Callahan. He was a good man. He died of fever, not anything dramatic, just a fever that would not break." Milton sat in the other chair. "I am sorry," he said. "After he died, everything in Abilene became difficult in ways I had not anticipated," she said. "Patrick had debts I did not know about. The bank held paper on the house. I sold what I could, packed what remained, and decided that Margaret's offer to come and stay with her in Reed Rock was the wisest path available to me." She looked at the fire. 19 days of traveling with 3 children is considerably different than I imagined it would be. "Most things are," Milton said. She looked at him. "You lost someone," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor, 4 years ago, childbirth, the child too." The room held that for a moment, the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who understand the specific weight of that kind of grief. "I am sorry," Theodora said. "I am getting on," he said. "The ranch keeps me occupied." She nodded slowly. "How long have you been out here?" 7 years, came down from Colorado after the war, needed somewhere that was mostly empty." He paused. "It suited me." "Do you not get lonely?" she asked, and then seemed to catch herself. "Forgive me, that is an impertinent question for midnight." "No more impertinent than knocking on a stranger's door at midnight," he said. She looked at him sharply, and then when she saw the measured expression on his face, her own expression changed. That ghost of a smile came back, and this time it went a little further before it faded. "Fair point," she said. "To answer your question," he said, "yes. Sometimes." She looked back at the fire. "So do I," she said quietly, "though I am rarely alone enough to notice it. 3 children see to that." They sat in companionable quiet for a while after that, the stove ticking, the canyon wind moving outside, October pressing against the windows. Eventually Theodora's head began to nod, and Milton said, firmly but gently, that she should go sleep beside her children. She protested briefly, and he told her, with the same calm practicality he had used all evening, that arguing about it at this hour made less sense than almost anything else she could do. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she went. Milton lay down on his horse blankets and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind, and for the first time in quite a long while, the sound of it did not feel quite so much like loneliness. In the morning, everything looked different in the way that things always do when daylight reclaims them from the mysteries of the night. Milton was up before dawn, as was his custom, and had coffee on and a pot of oatmeal made from his stores before any of his guests stirred. He went out in the gray pre-dawn to look at the wagon properly. It was worse than he had hoped and better than he had feared. The axle itself was intact, which was the main thing. The wheel had simply sheared off at the hub, and the hub itself was cracked but not destroyed. He walked around the wagon, examined the bed, found that a trunk had shifted and broken open its latch, and secured it with rope. He was checking the condition of the horse, a sturdy brown mare that had been tied to the fence post and was looking somewhat put upon, when he heard the door open behind him. Thomas came out first, the way boys do, heading directly toward anything of mechanical interest. He stopped a few feet from the damaged wheel and crouched down to look at it with the intense scientific focus of a 7-year-old who has decided something is interesting. "Can you fix it?" Thomas asked without looking up. "I think so," Milton said. "My father could fix things," Thomas said, still studying the wheel. "He fixed our clock 3 times. The 3rd time it never worked right again, but he tried." "That is the important part," Milton said. Thomas looked up at him then with a quick, evaluating look that reminded Milton startlingly of his mother's eyes. "Are you a good fixer?" "Adequate," Milton said. Thomas seemed to find this acceptable. He stood up and put his hands in his pockets. "Do you have any animals?" 30 head of cattle, Milton said. "A horse, and there is a barn cat that comes and goes as it pleases." Thomas brightened at the mention of the cat. "Can I see the cat?" "If you can find it," Milton said. "It does not always wish to be found." By the time Theodora appeared in the doorway with Lily and me, Thomas had already located the barn cat, a battle-scarred gray animal of indeterminate age and independent disposition, and was crouched in the barn doorway attempting a diplomatic negotiation regarding whether or not he was allowed to touch it. The cat's position on this matter was non-committal. Theodora stood in the early morning light in the yard, and Milton looked at her properly for the first time. In the daylight and without the urgency of midnight, she was striking in a way that went beyond the simple fact of her features. She had the kind of face that showed what it was thinking, and what it was thinking right now, as she looked around at his property and took in the condition of her wagon and the shape of the repair work ahead, was a complicated mixture of relief and resolve, and something that might have been stubborn determination not to let any of this overwhelm her. She was wearing a clean blouse she must have retrieved from her trunk, dark blue wool, and she had put her hair up properly, and the cut on her cheek was already beginning to form a small dark crust. She looked, Milton thought, like a woman who had made an accounting of her situation and arrived at practical conclusions. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee is inside." She looked at the wagon. "What is the verdict?" "The axle is sound. The hub is cracked, but I can brace it with iron plate and it will hold to redrock. The wheel itself I can reattach once the hub is braced. It will take most of the morning." Theodora nodded slowly. "And you are willing to do this?" "I said I would," he said. She looked at him in that direct way she had. "Mr. Wells, you let 4 strangers into your home at midnight, fed them, gave up your bedroom, and are now proposing to spend your morning repairing their wagon. I am trying to understand what motivates that kind of generosity so that I may properly appreciate it and not simply take it for granted." Milton considered this for a moment. "My mother raised me to believe that if you see something that needs doing and you are in a position to do it, you do it. That is about the sum of it." Theodora was quiet. Then she said, "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," he said. "Come inside before the coffee gets cold." Lily appeared at Theodora's elbow with the quiet competence of a 9-year-old who has learned to make herself useful. "Mama, Mi is asking for you. She is worried about the horse." "The mare?" Milton said. "Mi has a strong attachment to horses," Theodora said, with a note of wry resignation. "She wanted to sleep beside our mare in Kansas and very nearly succeeded." Milton found, unexpectedly, that this made him want to smile. He kept it from reaching his full face, but some of it must have shown, because Theodora looked at him with a sudden quick curiosity. He went to work on the wagon after breakfast, and the morning unfolded around his work in a way that felt peculiarly domestic and comfortable. Theodora organized and repacked the wagon bed with efficient precision, directing Lily and Thomas in moving and securing items, while me sat near the wheel hub watching Milton work with the solemn concentration of a foreman. He found himself explaining what he was doing, largely because the child's watchful silence seemed to demand it, and discovered that she nodded very seriously at each explanation in a way that suggested either genuine comprehension or a remarkably good imitation of it. "You have to make the iron plate bridge the crack," he said, fitting the plate against the hub. "See how the crack goes diagonal. If you run the plate across it and bolt it through, it distributes the load so the crack does not spread." Me nodded. "The risk is that the crack is already deep enough that the whole hub wants to give," he said. "So we reinforce from both sides." He held up a second plate. "Double it." Me nodded again with great seriousness. "You are a good engineer," Milton told her. Me beamed. By mid-morning, Thomas had given up on the barn cat's diplomatic process and graduated to helping Milton hold tools, which he did with impressive seriousness. Lily had found the broom inside and swept Milton's porch without being asked, which made Theodora start to say something corrective and then stop herself. Milton caught the exchange and said, "I appreciate it. I'm not much of a sweeper." "Lily takes after her father," Theodora said. "Patrick always had to have things orderly. It drove me half mad because I am less naturally organized, but now I find myself grateful she has that in her." Milton looked at the girl working the broom in steady, careful strokes. "She has steady hands," he said. "That is useful." Theodora was quiet for a moment. "She has been very steady throughout all of this," she said. "Steadier than I probably have been if I am honest." "You seem steady to me," Milton said, without looking up from his work. Another silence, this one different from the functional silences they had been moving through all morning. He heard her stop moving and then heard her begin moving again. "What you said just now," she said, "is more meaningful than you perhaps know. It has been a long 14 months. Milton set down his wrench and looked at her. She was standing beside the wagon with a folded blanket held against her chest, and her green eyes were bright with something that she was clearly not going to allow to become tears. Not out here in the morning yard with her children nearby and a stranger watching. He respected that. He also understood it in a way that went deeper than courtesy. "I imagine it has been," he said. "For what it is worth, Mrs. Callahan, from what I have seen in the last 10 or so hours, your children are fed and clothed and they trust you and they know they are loved. You drove 4 people across half the country by yourself. I think steady might be an understatement." Theodora stared at him. Something happened in her face that was complicated and quick, and then she pressed her lips together and looked away and said, "You are going to make me cry in a yard in front of my children at 10 in the morning, Mr. Wells, and I refuse to allow that." He picked up his wrench again. "Then I will stop talking and finish this wheel." "That would be appreciated," she said, but her voice had changed, had become something warmer and more human, and when Lily called from the porch asking whether she should bring out the water canteen, Theodora answered her with a steadiness that had lost its brittle edge and become something more like genuine calm. The wheel was done by noon. Milton rolled it out, fitted it back to the repaired hub, and drove a test run of the wagon around the yard, checking for play in the axle and listening to how the repaired hub handled the weight. It held. It was not new work, but it was solid work, and he said so. "How long will it hold?" Theodora asked. "Long enough to reach your sisters," he said. "Tell Henry Prout that the hub needs a proper wheelwright's attention before you use this wagon for any long hauls. He will know who to go to in Redrock." Theodora nodded. She had her hands clasped together in front of her in a posture that looked controlled but was not quite, the knuckles a little white. He pretended not to notice. "I have made some soup," she said, "for the noon meal. I found the dried vegetables in your pantry and I hope you do not mind. It seemed the least I could do." He minded not at all and said so. The soup was good, made with the dried vegetables and the remaining salt pork and some dried corn she had found, and she had seasoned it with something she had in her own supplies, because his pantry did not run to herbs. They ate at his kitchen table, all 5 of them, and the conversation was easy in the way that conversations sometimes become when people have already passed through the harder intimacy of crisis together, and find the ordinary things simpler by comparison. Thomas asked Milton about the cattle and received a thorough explanation of the ranching operation, which led to a request to see the cattle, which Milton said he could accommodate after lunch. Me ate her soup with focused purpose and at one point looked up at Milton and said with great solemnity, "Your cat is named Ghost." "Is it?" Milton said. Me nodded. "I named it," she said, "because it comes and goes." "That is a very suitable name," Milton said. "It was already named Jasper," Thomas said. "It is Ghost now," me said firmly, in a tone that brooked no discussion. Theodora pressed her lips together. Milton saw the movement and recognized it as the effort not to laugh. He made a similar effort himself. After lunch, Milton took Thomas out to see the cattle as promised, and Lily helped her mother wash up the soup pot and bowls in the way that had evidently become routine between them. Me sat on the porch with Ghost the barn cat, who had apparently decided that diplomatic relations with this particular child were acceptable and was tolerating being held with resigned dignity. Milton walked alongside Thomas through the lower pasture, watching the boy look at the cattle with a mixture of genuine interest and the kind of careful observation that suggested he was filing everything away for future reference. Thomas asked intelligent questions, and Milton answered them. The boy had a quality of attention that was unusual in a child his age, a capacity to actually listen to the answer rather than simply waiting for his turn to ask the next thing. "Did you always want to be a cattle rancher?" Thomas asked. "Not particularly," Milton said. "I wanted to be a cartographer when I was young, somebody who draws maps." Thomas looked at him with surprise. "Why didn't you?" "The war happened," Milton said simply. "After that, I needed open land more than I needed a drawing desk. The cattle came gradually. The ranch felt right." "My father wanted to be a school teacher," Thomas said, "but he had a family to support, so he worked at the dry goods store." "Sometimes the life we end up with is not the one we planned," Milton said. "That does not mean it is not a good one." Thomas was quiet for a moment, kicking at a clod of red earth. "Are you going to be sad when we leave?" he said, with the directness that belongs exclusively to 7-year-olds. Milton looked at him. The question, delivered so plainly, landed with more weight than Thomas could possibly have intended. "I expect I will be sorry to lose the company," Milton said carefully. "It has been good to have people in the house." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and moved on to his next question, which was about whether cattle had good memories. And Milton answered that, and the conversation continued, but the earlier question sat in Milton's chest in the way that true things sometimes do. By mid-afternoon, the wagon was loaded and ready. The mare was hitched. The children were assembled in the yard, and Theodora stood beside the wagon with her hands clasped again in that controlled posture, her hair back in its proper order, wearing her dark wool coat against the October afternoon chill. The cut on her cheek was already fading. "You have been extraordinarily generous," she said. "And I mean that genuinely, Mr. Wells, not as a social courtesy." "It was a pleasure," he said. "See that your sister puts some food into you before the week is out. All 4 of you look like you have been eating road dust for 3 weeks." She laughed at that, a real laugh, the first full one he had heard from her, and it was the kind of laugh that transformed a person's whole face. He noticed it in a way that he then tried to think about rationally and could not. "I will pass along your medical advice," she said. "Redrock is 7 miles east," he said. "The road is better from here. You should be there by dusk." She held out her hand, formal and direct. He shook it, and her grip was firm and honest. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," she said, "truly." "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Callahan," he said. The children said their goodbyes. Thomas shook Milton's hand with great seriousness. Lily thanked him politely for the corn bread. Mee, from her position in the wagon bed, pointed at the barn doorway where Ghost the cat was visible as a gray shape in the shadows and said, "I told Ghost goodbye already." "I will tell it again on your behalf," Milton said. Mee looked satisfied. Theodora clicked to the mare and the wagon moved, and Milton stood in his yard and watched until it turned onto the main road, and the dust settled over the wheel tracks in the red clay. And then he went inside and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and looked at the 4 chairs that had been full that morning and were empty now. And the silence of the house seemed to him, for the first time in years, not restful but simply empty. He went to Redrock 4 days later on his regular supply run, and it was entirely practical and reasonable that he would stop at Henry Pruitt's grain store, since he needed grain. He told himself this firmly on the 7-mile ride into town. It was a completely ordinary errand. He needed grain. Henry Pruitt sold grain. These 2 facts were unrelated to anything else. Henry Pruitt was behind his counter when Milton came in, a cheerful, heavy-set man with a red beard and the comfortable manner of a person who genuinely liked his work. He shook Milton's hand with enthusiasm. "Wells, good to see you. Heard you had some company a few nights back." Word traveled fast, Milton thought. "Your sister-in-law," he said. "She and her children made it here all right." Fine, fine, Henry said. Theo is a tough one, no question. Doesn't complain. Not once since she's been here has she said a word about how hard that trip must have been. Drives Margaret half crazy, the not complaining. He leaned on the counter. She speaks highly of you, I'll tell you that much. Said you were the most sensible man she'd met since leaving Kansas. Milton said he was glad she arrived safely and then ordered his grain. He did not ask any additional questions. He paid for his grain and had it loaded on Compass's pack frame and was almost out the door when Henry said cheerfully, "She's across the street at the dry goods if you wanted to say hello." Milton paused with his hand on the doorframe. He was quiet for a moment, which Henry Prout correctly interpreted as something other than indifference. "She's been worrying about whether that wheel is going to hold until she can get it to the wheelwright," Henry added. "I keep telling her you do good work, but she's the type that likes to verify things herself." Milton said he might stop in. He crossed the street to Morrison's Dry Goods, which was the main general store in Reed Rock, a wide-fronted establishment with a porch running its length and barrels of dried goods arranged outside the door. He found Theodora Callahan inside, examining a bolt of cloth with Lily beside her and Thomas and me engaged in an intense examination of the candy jars on the counter, which me was staring at with the expression of someone conducting a serious scientific survey. Theodora looked up when the bell above the door sounded, and something happened in her face when she saw him, a quick brightening that she then very carefully composed into something more neutral. He noticed both things. "Mr. Wells," she said, "I was not expecting to see you." "Supply run," he said. "I stop by most Thursdays." "Of course." She held his gaze for a moment. "How is Ghost?" "Still there," he said. Opinionated about its sleeping arrangements but present. The Ghost's smile came back fuller this time. "I am glad to hear it. Me has spoken of little else since we arrived. Margaret thinks we may need to acquire a cat." Milton stepped further inside. Thomas had spotted him and came over immediately. "Did you see the candy jars?" Thomas asked with the urgency of someone reporting a critical development. "I have seen them," Milton said. "There are peppermints," Thomas said. "So there are. I am making a case to my mother." "How is that going?" "Early stages," Thomas said seriously. Milton reached in his coat pocket, found 2 coins and held them out. "Buy yourself and your sisters a peppermint each," he said quietly. "Do not make it a habit." Thomas looked at the coins with enormous gravity, then up at Milton. "Thank you," he said, and went to make his case to the proprietor's wife behind the counter. When Milton looked back at Theodora, she was watching him with an expression he was finding harder and harder to not look at directly. It was the kind of expression that required, he thought, more acknowledgement than the current setting probably allowed. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, "the wheel holding up." "As far as I can tell," she said. "I am taking it to the wheelwright tomorrow." "I wanted to thank you again, Mr. Wells. Henry told me what you said about the hub. You were right about the brace." "Good." He paused. He should, by any reasonable assessment of the situation, now say something polite and leave to complete his remaining errands. "Are you settling in well?" he heard himself ask instead. "Better than I hoped," she said. "Margaret is good company. The children are adjusting. Lily has already been to look at the schoolhouse and came home with 14 observations about how it compared favorably and unfavorably to her school in Abilene, in roughly equal measure." "That sounds like Lily," he said. "It does rather," she agreed. She looked at the bolt of cloth in her hands, then set it back on the shelf. "I'm hoping to find work," she said directly, the way she said most things. "I do not intend to impose on Henry and Margaret indefinitely. I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can teach if the schoolteacher position becomes available." She paused. "It seems important to tell you this since you know our situation." "Why is it important to tell me?" he said. She held his gaze steadily. "Because you helped us," she said. "And I am not a person who takes help without accounting for it. I want you to know that we are not going to be a burden to Margaret and Henry or to this community. We are going to make our own way." "I never doubted it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and there was something in the air between them that was not yet anything that could be named but was moving in a definite direction, and both of them knew it. "I wonder," he said carefully, "whether you might allow me to call on you, properly, at your sister's home." He paused. "I recognize that is forward, and I apologize if the timing is—" "Yes," she said. "I would like that." He had been preparing to apologize more thoroughly, and the directness of her response stopped him. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday would be fine," she said. He nodded once formally. She nodded back. Me appeared at his elbow with a peppermint in each hand, one already in her mouth and one apparently being saved for a strategic reserve, and said through the peppermint, "Are you coming to our house?" "Sunday," he said. Me nodded as if this was simply the correct order of events. He called on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. Henry and Margaret Prout received him with a combination of genuine warmth and the barely concealed delight of people who have wanted something to happen and are watching it happen. Margaret, who was plumper and more openly expressive than her sister, and had Theodora's same green eyes but a much more freely deployed laugh, made coffee and pies, and found reasons to take the children to other rooms with the subtlety of someone who had thought carefully about tactics. Milton and Theodora sat in the Prouts' parlor and talked. They talked about everything and nothing, in the way that two people do when they are learning the full shape of each other, moving around the edges of the important things and then, gradually, moving toward them. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a schoolteacher, which explained Lily, that she had married Patrick Callahan at 22 and moved with him to Kansas, that she had been happy there in an ordinary, sustainable way that she had not fully appreciated until it was gone. She learned that he had fought at Shiloh, that he did not talk about it much, that Alina had been a girl from Colorado whose family had homesteaded land next to his first claim, that he had loved her in a straightforward way that had left a straightforward kind of absence behind it. One Sunday in late November, with frost on the window glass and a fire in the Prouts' parlor hearth, Theodora said, "I think you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time." "I do not see the use of being otherwise," he said. "Patrick was honest," she said, "but he was also someone who managed things. He would manage situations and manage information to protect people from worry. I understood why, but it made things harder in the end because I did not have accurate information about our finances, and when he died, the shape of things was very different from what I thought." She looked at the fire. "I have come to value honesty very highly since then." "I can tell you," Milton said, "that I have 30 head of cattle, a mortgage on the land that I have 2 more years to clear, and at this moment $54 and some change in the bank in Reed Rock. I have no debts beyond the mortgage. The ranch makes a modest profit. I am not a rich man." She looked at him with startled attention. "That is a remarkably direct financial disclosure." "You said you valued accurate information," he said. Her eyes were very bright. "I did say that." "I am also," he said, "aware that I am sitting in your brother-in-law's parlor on my 4th Sunday visit with a fairly transparent motivation, and it seems only honest to name it clearly." "What is the motivation?" she said, and her voice was composed but her eyes were not. "I would like to court you," he said, "with genuine intent. I am not a man who does things partially." Theodora was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Outside, the Colorado wind was moving through the bare cottonwood trees along the street, making a sound like rushing water. Inside, the fire snapped. "Milton," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the preceding title, and it arrived with a different quality, more personal and more final, like a door opening. "I think my children are somewhat already decided on the matter." "What about you?" he said. "I am more careful than my children," she said. "I have reason to be." She paused. "But I am also not afraid of honest intentions." She looked at him. "Court me then, and we will see what we see." He courted her. He brought her books from the small lending library that Morrison's dry goods maintained, because he had learned she read whenever she could get her hands on something worth reading. He brought candy for the children, peppermints for Thomas, lemon drops for Lily, and molasses candy for me, because he had catalogued their preferences with the thoroughness of someone who paid attention to the details of people he cared about. He repaired a section of fence in Henry's yard that had been leaning since before the first frost, because it needed doing and he was there. He took Theodora walking on Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted, along the road past the church and down toward the creek where the cottonwoods grew, and they talked and sometimes walked in silence, and the silence was, by December, entirely comfortable. He watched her with her children and saw the whole of her in it, the way she managed Lily's seriousness with humor, Thomas's energy with patience, Me's fierce independence with a combination of firmness and delight that suggested she found the child's force of personality as amusing as it was exhausting. He saw her worry, the practical nighttime kind that shows in the tension around the eyes, about money and the future, and whether the wheelwright had truly made the wagon sound. He saw her laugh, the full version, which remained something that arrived with the quality of a gift. He saw her read, absorbed and still, which was a different version of her than any other, softer at the edges. He was falling in love with her in the steady, total way that serious people fall in love, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply deepens with each ordinary interaction, until one day you look at the situation clearly and understand that the foundation has been laid for quite some time. On a Friday in mid-December, he came into town not on his regular Thursday, but because something had been decided in him, quietly and firmly, and he wanted to do something about it before he thought about it too long and became sensible. He went to Morrison's dry goods and spent a careful 15 minutes examining a small collection of items that Mr. Morrison kept in a locked glass case near the back of the store. He made a selection. He paid for it. He put it in his coat pocket, and then he went to call on Theodora, unannounced, on a Friday afternoon instead of a Sunday, which was irregular enough that Margaret Prout opened the door and stared at him with an expression of absolute delight before she had time to arrange her face. Theodora was in the kitchen helping Margaret prepare dinner and came out to the parlor with flour on her hands and a slightly puzzled expression. She wiped her hands on her apron. "It is a Friday," she said. "I am aware," he said. She looked at him. Something in his expression communicated a seriousness beyond the ordinary, and her composure shifted into something more attentive. "Sit down, then," she said. They sat. He was quiet for a moment, which was not unusual for him, but she could feel the difference in this particular silence, and she sat very still. "I know that 14 months is not long," he said. "And I know 19 days of trail travel does not make the longest acquaintance. And I know you have 3 children and a sister to consider, and that your situation requires practicality above sentiment." He paused. "I have been trying to think of the sensible timing for this, and I cannot find it, so I have decided to be direct instead, which you have said you appreciate." "I have said that," she agreed, and her voice was not quite as steady as usual. He reached into his coat pocket and set on the table between them a small brooch, oval-shaped, with a spray of tiny garnets set in silver. It was not a ring. He was not a man who would assume the answer before asking the question. It was simply something he had wanted to give her, a thing that was hers, because he wanted there to be something tangible between them that said more than words before he asked the words. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Theodora," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I have thought about it honestly and thoroughly, including the parts that are complicated, which I recognize are substantial. I am asking because I want to, not because it is practical, though I believe it may also be practical, but mainly because I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in your company, and also in the company of your 3 children, who I find entirely remarkable." He stopped. "That is the proposal. I am aware it is not poetic. Theodora stared at him for what felt, to Milton, like a significant portion of his remaining lifespan. Then she said, "It is completely poetic." "It is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." He waited. "Yes," she said. "Milton, yes." He let out a breath he had perhaps been holding for 6 weeks. She reached across the table and picked up the brooch and held it in her palm, and when she looked up her eyes were entirely brilliant and not at all composed. He reached across and took her other hand, which had flour still dried in the creases of the knuckles, and held it, and they sat like that for a moment with the winter light coming through the parlor window and the sound of Margaret Prout in the kitchen, very deliberately not listening. "The children," Theodora said. "I need to talk to them properly before any decisions are final." "Of course," he said. "Lily will have questions," she said, "detailed ones. I would expect nothing less. Thomas will want to know about the cattle and the cat. I have already briefed him fairly extensively on both topics." She laughed, the full laugh, the one that changed her whole face. He looked at it without pretending not to. "Me," she said, "will simply assume it is correct because she has apparently already decided." "She told me the cat's name," he said. "I think that may have been the beginning." Theodora looked down at the brooch in her hand. "I want to be honest with you as well," she said. "'Cause you said you valued it, and I do too. I'm not without fear. I was married before and I lost him, and I know what that costs. I'm not going to pretend I am approaching this without that history behind me." "I know," he said. "I have the same history, different shape, same weight. But," she said, and her thumb moved across the garnets in the brooch, "I also know what a good man looks like. I have known one and I know one now, and I am not willing to refuse good things out of fear of loss." She looked up at him. "So yes, my answer is yes, with my full understanding of what I am saying." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against the back of it, a formal and deliberate gesture, old-fashioned and entirely genuine. She watched him do it with those green eyes that were not composed at all at this point, and she did not try to make them so. Margaret Prout came out of the kitchen 30 seconds later with a remarkable lack of pretense about how she happened to be there, and upon hearing the news produced a sound of joy that brought Henry in from the yard and Thomas in from whatever he had been doing upstairs. Lily came down the stairs with her characteristic controlled expression, listened to the explanation with careful attention, and then asked Milton 7 questions in sequence, covering topics including the condition of the ranch house, his intentions regarding schooling for herself and Thomas and me, whether he had ever been convicted of any crime, what his view was on fair treatment of the workers he hired for the cattle, and what the annual yield of the ranch looked like on average. Milton answered each question directly and thoroughly. Lily listened to each answer, nodded once when he finished the last one, and then said, "All right then," and went back upstairs with the air of someone who had conducted a reasonable assessment and reached a reasonable conclusion. Thomas, for his part, said, "Does this mean we are moving to the ranch?" And when told yes, said, "Good," with a satisfaction that required no further elaboration. Me was found on the back porch, apparently already in a conversation with a passing stray dog. When informed that Milton was to be her new father, she said, "I know," and returned to the dog conversation. They were married on a Saturday in February, 1874, in the small white church at the end of Ridrock's Main Street, with Henry Prout standing as witness and Margaret Prout crying beautifully through the entire ceremony, and Lily standing with composed dignity beside her mother and Thomas fidgeting with his collar, and me sitting in the front pew with Ghost the barn cat, who had been smuggled into the church under her coat, and discovered only after the ceremony was already underway. At which point, the Reverend took the philosophical position that God's creatures were welcome. Theodora wore a dress of deep green wool that Margaret had helped her sew, and her dark auburn hair was pinned with the garnet brooch. When she walked up the aisle of that small church in the February light, with the sun making the ice on the windows throw small rainbows onto the whitewashed walls, Milton looked at her and thought that he had been waiting, without knowing it, for a very long time. The words they said to each other were the words the church had used for centuries, plain and serious and permanent. And when Milton said them, he meant every syllable with the full weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean. When Theodora said them, her voice was steady and clear and entirely her own. The first months on the ranch were an education in all directions. The house, which had been thoroughly adequate for a solitary man and entirely sufficient for a man and a borrowed cat, underwent immediate and significant reorganization at the hands of Theodora Callahan Wells, who had, it turned out, opinions about the arrangement of a kitchen that were strongly held and not negotiable. Milton stood back and let it happen with the good sense of a man who understood that a household managed by Theodora would function better than one managed by himself, and he was correct. The children settled with the speed and adaptability of young people, which is to say completely and almost immediately. Thomas was given a section of the barn to take responsibility for and accepted this commission with tremendous seriousness. Lily enrolled in the Redrock schoolhouse and came home each day with the kind of reports on its academic standards that suggested she was simultaneously educating and terrifying her teacher. A young man recently arrived from the East who had perhaps not anticipated this particular frontier of his chosen vocation. Me established sovereignty over a particular corner of the yard near the water trough, in which she began various projects of unclear purpose but evident importance, and Ghost the cat presided over all of it with regal impartiality. Milton watched his house become a home with a kind of stunned and grateful attention. He had not realized, in the years since Aliner's death, how fully he had reduced his expectations of daily life to the functional and essential, how thoroughly he had stopped expecting the house to have noise and color, and the particular domestic chaos of children living in it. Theodora had been right that she was less naturally orderly than Lily. She had a way of turning a kitchen inside out in the process of making something extraordinary from whatever ingredients were available, and a habit of leaving books in unconventional places, and an entirely personal system of organization that made complete sense if you understood the underlying logic, which Milton worked at diligently and achieved within about 6 weeks. What he had not expected, or perhaps had not let himself expect, was the simple reality of not being alone. Of someone being there in the morning when he came in from the early chores, with coffee already made, and the particular specific intelligence of her eyes across the table. Of someone to think things through with, to run the farm accounts with, to discuss the decisions that ranching required. Theodora had a practical intelligence for numbers and an honest instinct for problems, and she applied both to the business of the ranch with the same purposeful directness she applied to everything, and within 3 months the accounts were more orderly than they had been in years. They were good together in the practical ways, but it was the private ways that surprised Milton most, the depth and ease of the intimacy between them, the way she could read his silences with an accuracy that sometimes startled him, the way he could make her laugh in a way that was entirely different from the public version, looser and less guarded, that belonged only to the two of them. She cried twice in those early months, once about Patrick and once about nothing specific, just the accumulated weight of the last 14 months releasing itself in the safety of somewhere it could finally afford to. Both times he held her and said nothing and let the feeling be what it was, and both times she came back from it lighter, the way people do when they have been carrying something too long in silence and find at last that they are allowed to set it down. In return, he told her about Shiloh, which he had not told anyone in a very long time. He told her what the fields had looked like afterward, and what that kind of thing does to the inside of a person, and she listened without trying to fix it or rationalize it, which was exactly right. She simply listened and held his hand and said, "You came back from it and made something good," and that was more than enough. By spring, the ranch had taken on a different quality. Theodora had planted a kitchen garden behind the house using seeds she had brought from Kansas, modest but determined rows of tomatoes and beans and onions that Thomas watered with proprietary pride. The fence line that bordered the south pasture, which had been needing attention since the fall, was repaired over 3 solid weekends with Thomas as Milton's assistant, handing tools with the same seriousness he had given the peppermint investigation in Morrison's dry goods. Lily had commenced a campaign to acquire books for the household, a project she approached with such organizational precision that by April there was a small but respectable collection on the shelf Milton built for the purpose. Me turned 5 in April, and the occasion was marked with a cake that Theodora made from corn flour and dried fruit and honey, which was received with the gravity it deserved. Me announced that she was now old enough to ride a horse, which position Theodora negotiated down to sitting on compass with Milton holding the bridle, a compromise that Me accepted under protest but with evident pleasure. The mortgage payment came due at the end of April, and Milton made it with the savings account that was now somewhat healthier owing to Theodora's management of the accounts and a better-than-expected price for the fall cattle. And the man at the bank in Redrock shook his hand and said there was 1 year remaining on the note. And Milton rode home and told Theodora, and she sat at the kitchen table and did the calculation on paper and then looked up and said, "We can clear it before Christmas." He looked at the paper. She was right. How, he said, she had a plan. She had been developing it for 2 months without mentioning it, in the way she had of thinking things all the way through before presenting them, which was efficient and somewhat alarming but consistently impressive. The plan involved leasing 20 acres of the north pasture to Henry Prout for winter grazing of a small herd he was looking to expand, a lease that would bring in steady income through the summer and fall, combined with a contract she had already inquired about at the grain store for Redrock's growing population, and the additional income from a small boarding operation for horses she proposed to run from the barn's second section, which Thomas enthusiastically seconded. Milton studied the paper. He looked at his wife. "You have been planning this for a while," he said. 2 months, she said. "I wanted to make sure it was sound before I presented it." He looked back at the paper. "It is sound," he said. "I know," she said, with a matter-of-factness that he found entirely endearing. There were harder things that spring, as there always are. There was a week in late March when 3 of the cattle went sick, and Milton spent 4 nights in the south pasture trying to manage it. And Theodora brought him food and coffee at midnight with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which he had made corn bread for her at midnight 5 months earlier. And he looked up at her standing in the field with the lantern, and thought that the specific nature of love, the way it shows itself not in grand gestures, but in exactly this. The person who shows up at midnight with the coffee was something he had forgotten and was grateful to have remembered. One evening in late May, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the warm spring dark listening to the creek at the bottom of the property, and Theodora said, quietly, "I am going to have a baby." Milton was very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, and she was watching him with those green eyes that gave everything away when she let them, and right now she was letting them, all the complicated joy and fear and hope of it visible and unguarded. He reached over and took her hand. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. He held her hand and looked at the dark beyond the porch and felt something moving through him that was large enough that he did not immediately have words for it. He had lost a leaner to this, and the child too, and the memory of that was never very far. But he was also sitting here with Theodora, who was looking at him steadily and honestly, and with the particular courage of a woman who has walked into something knowing its full weight and chosen it anyway. "We should get you to the doctor in Redrock soon," he said. "Dr. Hartley is good." "I have already been," she said. "Last week. I wanted to confirm it before I told you." He looked at her. "And healthy," she said. "He expects late November." She paused. "I know what you are thinking about." "I know you do," he said. "I am going to be fine," she said. not with the forced brightness of someone trying to convince themselves, but with the grounded certainty of a woman who has looked at the odds and decided on the outcome. I am strong and I am healthy and I have delivered 3 children successfully. I am going to be fine. He raised her hand to his lips, the same gesture as the parlor in December, formal and deliberate and entirely genuine. I know you are, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the May dark and listened to the creek, and the spring around them was enormous and alive with it. He told the children the following evening at dinner, because Theodora said they should know from them and not from overheard conversations. Lily received the news with the characteristic careful processing face, and then asked, with evident relief, whether it would be a boy or a girl, and when told that this was not yet known, seemed to find this acceptable. Thomas said, "Can I name it?" and was told that naming rights would be discussed more broadly. Mee said, "I knew," and went back to her supper, which was exactly what Milton had expected, and which made Theodora close her eyes briefly with the expression of someone who finds their 4-year-old simultaneously infuriating and deeply amusing. Summer came to the ranch in full and generous measure. The kitchen garden produced beyond what Theodora had hoped. The horse boarding operation began with 2 animals belonging to a couple passing through to California and grew within the month to 5 regular boarders, which was about the capacity of the barn section without expansion, and expansion became Milton's project for July. Thomas proved to be a genuinely useful hand in the barn, developing a sensitivity to horses that surprised no one who had paid attention to the way he'd been around animals since they arrived. Lily discovered that her schoolteacher, the young man from the East whose name was Mr. Benjamin Crowder, was actually quite learned in history and literature, and revised her assessment of the Redrock schoolhouse from moderately adequate to satisfactory with caveats. She came home in July saying that Mr. Crowder had lent her a collection of essays by a man named Emerson, which she was reading with focused intensity. Milton read it after her, and they had a serious discussion about it over the course of several evenings that left Theodora both proud and somewhat mystified by both of them. In late July, a man named Corey Dale came to hire on for the fall cattle drive that Milton was planning, having heard through the circuit of ranch hands that Wells out on the Lower Canyon Road ran a decent operation and treated his people fairly. He was a lean, weathered man of about 40, quiet and competent, who had been working cattle from Arizona to Colorado for 20 years. Milton hired him after a direct conversation about expectations on both sides, and Dale proved to be everything his reputation suggested. He was also, over the course of the summer, quietly respectful of the household in a way that Milton appreciated without having to name it. Theodora was, by August, visibly and magnificently pregnant in the way that healthy women carry it, and she continued to manage the accounts and the house and the horse boarding operation and the kitchen garden with the same organized energy she applied to everything, simply at a slightly adjusted pace. She had a habit in the evenings of sitting in the rocking chair on the porch with her hands folded over her belly, watching the sunset over the canyon, and it became Milton's habit to come and sit beside her for this portion of the day regardless of what other tasks remained, because it was the part of the day he valued most, and he had learned not to postpone what he valued. He told her this one evening in September, sitting on the porch with the canyon going red and gold in the last of the light, and she looked at him sideways in the way she had that was specific to him, that particular combination of warmth and amusement and something deeper. "Where did you put that before us?" she said. "Nowhere," he said. "I did not know to put it anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you opened the door," she said. "I am glad you knocked," he said. She reached over without looking at him and took his hand, the same plain gesture they had exchanged many times, but each time carrying the same specific weight. They watched the canyon go dark together and the first stars appeared over the rim, and below them the creek sounded in the cooling air, and the horses in the barn were quiet, and the house behind them breathed with the particular life of a place where people live well and know it. The cattle drive in October went well, Dale managing the trail end with the efficiency of long experience while Milton handled the selling end in the market town 2 days east. The price was good, better than the previous year, and when Milton came home with the figure, Theodora did the calculation in her head before he had finished telling it to her and said, "We clear the mortgage before October is out," and was correct. He made the final payment at the bank on a Tuesday. The banker, a man named Willard Hayes who had held this note for 7 years, shook Milton's hand with genuine warmth. "Free and clear," Hayes said. "That is a fine thing, Mr. Wells. Particularly given the additions you've made to your operation this year." "My wife's plans," Milton said. "Then you married wisely," Hayes said. "I did," Milton said. He came home and told Theodora, and she sat at the kitchen table with the receipt in her hands and read it twice, and then set it down and looked at him with an expression that was very full and very quiet. And then she stood up and came to him, and he put his arms around her and they stood in the kitchen in the October afternoon. And outside the first frost of the season was making the grass white along the creek bank. And the house was theirs, and everything in it was theirs. And it was October, and a year ago almost to the week she had been standing in a yard in Kansas with debts, and 3 children, and a wagon that needed fixing. And now she was standing in a kitchen in Colorado with her husband's arms around her and land under her feet that nobody could take away. "Well," she said into his shoulder. "Well," he said. "We did that," she said. "You did most of it," he said. "We did it," she repeated firmly, which was final on the matter. The baby came in late November, as Dr. Hartley had predicted, on a night when the snow was coming down in the soft, serious way that means a real accumulation, the kind of night that closes the world to a small, warm circle around the hearth. Theodora labored through that night with Milton beside her and Margaret Prout, who had come out 3 days before in anticipation, managing proceedings with the calm authority of a woman who had delivered 2 of her own children and was disinclined to be alarmed. It was a boy. He came into the world in the early hours before dawn, in the bedroom of a house that was free and clear and full of people who loved each other, announcing himself with the vigorous outrage of a person who found the transition from one world to the next a considerable imposition. The lamp threw gold light over everything, and outside the snow was still falling, and inside everything was warmth, and the exhausted, overwhelmed fullness of a thing that has been worth waiting for. Milton held his son for the first time in the rocking chair beside the bed where Theodora lay sleeping, and the child was unfathomably small and entirely real, and he sat there in the lamplight with the child against his chest, and felt something complete itself in him that had been open for a very long time. When Theodora woke, he was still there. She looked at him across the room with eyes that were heavy-lidded with exhaustion and entirely at peace, and he carried the child to her, and she settled him against her with the practiced ease of a woman who has done this before and the specific new tenderness of a woman doing it again, differently, better. "What shall we call him?" Milton said. They had discussed names at length over the past months. She had opinions and he had opinions, and there had been a running negotiation that was partly serious and partly the kind of conversation couples have when they are simply enjoying having conversations. Lily had submitted a list of 7 suggestions with annotations. Thomas had proposed names exclusively from the classical world, beginning with Marcus Aurelius, which Theodora had gently declined. Me had said simply, something good, which was not maximally helpful but was thematically sound. Patrick, Theodora said, not with grief but with a kind of generous wholeness, an acknowledgement of the full story that had led to this room and this moment. She looked at Milton. "If you are comfortable with that." "I think it is right," he said. "Patrick Milton Wells," she said, settling on the combination with the decisiveness that meant it was decided. Patrick for who he came from and Milton for who he is going to. He looked at the child and then at his wife, and the room was full of the kind of quiet that is not empty but replete, the kind that comes after something important has happened, and the world has caught up with itself. In the days that followed, the house organized itself around the new arrival with the smooth efficiency of a household that already knew what it was doing. Lily took on a maternal precision with Patrick that was both touching and slightly alarming in its thoroughness. Thomas, who had initially been somewhat cautious about the whole baby project, was converted entirely upon discovering that the baby would grip his finger with surprising strength, which Thomas found impressive and worth demonstrating to everyone who would stand still long enough to observe it. Me informed Patrick from a very close range that she was his sister Me, and that she was in charge, and that if he needed anything he should ask her, and then looked up at Theodora for confirmation that this was acceptable. And Theodora said, solemnly, "I am sure he will come to you with any questions," which Me received as the reasonable arrangement it clearly was. Corey Dale, who was wintering at the ranch in the bunkhouse that Milton had expanded in the fall, said nothing particular about the baby but left a carved wooden horse on the porch one morning, smoothed and polished and detailed with the care of someone who had spent a lot of time alone with a knife and wood. And when Theodora found it and brought it in, she put it on the windowsill where the morning light came through and left it there. Christmas came to the ranch with the kind of full, unhurried generosity that belongs to a place that has earned its peace. Henry and Margaret Prout came out on Christmas Eve and stayed through Christmas Day, and the house was crammed with 6 adults, 3 children plus a baby, and Ghost the barn cat, who considered indoor access in winter a diplomatic right. Margaret and Theodora cooked together in the kitchen, in the way of sisters who have a private language developed over decades, completing each other's sentences and disagreeing about seasonings and producing food that would have been remarkable in any setting, and was particularly extraordinary given the frontier kitchen it came from. Milton carved a small horse for me and a pair of proper work gloves for Thomas, which Thomas received with the satisfaction of someone being recognized as a contributing member of the operation. He had found a book for Lily in a store in the market town during the cattle drive, a proper collected edition of narrative poems, which she opened with the contained excitement of a 10-year-old who has learned not to let her enthusiasm look excessive, and then completely failed to contain it. For Theodora he had made something over the last 2 months in the barn in the evenings, a writing box of polished cedar wood with small compartments for ink and paper, and a section for letters to be kept, because she wrote to her sister Margaret and to several friends from Kansas and to her aunt in Missouri, and she did it on whatever surface was available, and he thought she deserved a proper place for it. She opened it on Christmas morning with the children around her and turned it in her hands, examining the compartments, and when she looked up at him her eyes were the full green he associated now with everything most important, and she said, "You made this." "Over the last couple months," he said. She stood up and came and kissed him, not with the composed public version but the real one, and Margaret said something cheerful and Henry laughed, and Lily made the face she made at adult sentiment, which was somewhere between dignified tolerance and reluctant fondness. January brought cold and work, as it always did. The cattle needed tending through the freeze and the horse boarding operation required more attention in the hard weather. Theodora ran the household accounts through the coldest weeks from the kitchen table, with Patrick in his cradle beside her, and the ledger books spread out, and a cup of coffee that she periodically forgot and had to reheat. Milton came in from the morning chores to find her like this on a regular basis, and it became his own particular private census of all the things that made up a life worth living. One morning in late January, Thomas came in from the barn with an expression that combined several things at once: pride, uncertainty, and the specific look of a child who is about to deliver information he is not entirely sure will be received well. "One of the boarding horses is sick," he said. Milton was already putting on his coat. "Show me." It was a roaning mare that belonged to a rancher 2 properties over, a woman named Clara Birch who ran her own cattle operation on the far side of the canyon road. The mare had a fever and a cough that had developed overnight. Milton examined her and then rode out to the Birch place and told Clara Birch directly what he'd found and what he proposed to do about it. And Clara, who was a broad-shouldered woman of 50 who had homesteaded her land 20 years ago and managed it since her husband's death with a directness that Milton respected, said, "Good. You handle it. Send me the bill." The mare recovered over 2 weeks. Thomas sat with her on a daily basis and monitored her temperature with a seriousness that impressed Dale and a vigilance that impressed the mare's owner. When Clara Birch came to retrieve her recovered animal, she looked at Thomas and said, "You have a good hand with horses, young man." And Thomas carried this observation around with him for weeks, occasionally producing it like a coin to be examined. Spring returned to the canyon country with the usual extravagance. The cottonwoods going green along the creek, the scrub coming back on the canyon rim, the kitchen garden ready to be turned and planted again with the experience of a full year behind it. Patrick, who was growing at the rate common to healthy babies, and had already shown signs of the particular force of personality that seemed to be a family trait, was conducting a vigorous personal exploration of his immediate environment from the cradle and later from a blanket on the floor, watched over by me, who took her supervisory responsibilities with a conscientiousness that occasionally required Theodora to remind her that he also needed to be allowed to breathe. It was a morning in April, clear and warm with the smell of the thawed creek on the air, when Theodora came out to where Milton was working on the fence and stood for a moment watching him before he noticed her. He looked up. She had her hair down, which she rarely did in the mornings before she had organized herself, and she was wearing the blue blouse from the day he had first seen her in Red Rock, and she was squinting into the sun, and she was, he thought with the particular freshness that being in love grants a person even in the middle of ordinary days, the most beautiful woman he had ever known. Not because of the specific facts of her face, though those were fine, but because of the entirety of her, the intelligence and the directness and the way she loved her children and the way she ran the accounts and the way she laughed and the way she had sat on the porch of a strange man's house at midnight with 3 frightened children and looked him in the eye and been herself completely. "What?" she said, noticing his expression. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She gave him the sideways look. "You are being sentimental at 10 in the morning. I am allowed," he said. She came over and leaned against the fence post he was working beside, and they were quiet together in the warm April morning, the canyon below them going green and the sky over the rim going that deep Colorado blue that has no equal, and the ranch spread out around them, their cattle in the lower pasture, their horses in the barn, their children visible through the open kitchen door. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "Another baby," she said. He set down his hammer. He looked at her in the April light, and she was looking back at him with those full, honest eyes, and he reached out and put his hand against her face carefully, over the place where the cut had been that first night, which was long healed and gone, and she leaned into his hand for a moment the way she did when she was letting herself rest inside something. "Are you well?" he said. "Very well," she said. "Dr. Hartley says October." A year and change since a wagon wheel had snapped in the dark on the road, outside his property, and the rest of his life had begun. He thought about that with the particular sensation of a man who understands that the universe works on principles too complicated to trace fully, but occasionally shows its hand. "October," he said. "It is appropriate, I think," she said, "given everything." He put his arms around her in the April morning, and she put her arms around him, and they stood like that for a while with the canyon below them and the sky above and everything they had built between them and in them and around them, solid and real and warm in the spring sun. Me appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at them for a moment. "Are you hugging?" she called. "Yes," Milton said. Me considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back inside. By summer, The ranch had expanded to include a small additional parcel of land on the north side that Milton had purchased from a man who was moving his family to Oregon. 30 acres of good pasture that extended the grazing range and gave the horseboarding operation room to grow. Corey Dale had agreed to stay on permanently, having found in this particular stretch of Colorado Canyon country a place that suited him, and he and Thomas had developed a partnership that was instructive to watch, the older man's 20 years of accumulated animal wisdom being absorbed by the younger with the systematic intensity of someone who understands exactly what is being offered. Lily, at 11 years old, had become indispensable at the schoolhouse, in a way that Mr. Crowder managed with a mixture of gratitude and the faint professional anxiety of a man who is being evaluated daily by a child. She had also begun helping Theodora with the accounts on the days when Patrick required more direct supervision, and her facility with numbers was quietly extraordinary, which Milton noted and began thinking about in terms of what education might look like for her in the coming years. He raised this with Theodora one evening. There were schools of a more serious kind in Denver, he said. Not immediately and not necessarily permanently, but worth knowing about and planning for. Theodora listened and then said that she had already written to the school in Denver and received information about their curriculum, which she had been reviewing. "You have already written," he said. "2 months ago," she said. "I wanted the information before I raised it." He looked at her. "Did you know I was going to bring it up?" "I thought it likely," she said. "You notice things carefully." He shook his head slowly. "We are very well matched," he said. "I know," she said. "I knew quite early, actually. When," he said, "she thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything. When you made the oatmeal," she said. He stared at her. "The oatmeal." "In the morning after that first night," she said. "You had made oatmeal before any of us were up. You did not know when we would wake or whether we would want it. You simply made it because we were there and we were presumably hungry. You were not performing generosity. You were not making a point about your character. You simply did the necessary thing because it was necessary." She met his eyes. "That is the kind of person I had spent a long time hoping still existed." Milton was quiet for a moment. "That is a great deal to read into a pot of oatmeal," he said. "I am a careful reader," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was, by now, one of his most natural acts in the world. "I knew earlier than the oatmeal," he said. "When?" she said. "When you told me you would not impose," he said. "At midnight. With mud on your boots and 3 children holding onto your coat and a broken wagon behind you. You were worried about imposing." She was quiet. "The quality of a person," he said, "is clearest when the circumstances are hardest. That is what I saw then." She pressed her lips together in the way she had when she was not going to cry, but the feeling was present. He held her hand and let the moment be. The 2nd October came round, and with it the quality of light that he would always associate now with the beginning of everything. That particular slant of afternoon gold on Red Canyon rock, the smell of the season turning. He checked the road twice a day, which was not a rational habit but was an honest one, a private observance of a private anniversary. The baby came in late October, healthy and loud and clear about its preferences from the first moment. Another boy, compact and dark-haired and with green eyes that appeared within the first week and stayed. They named him James Henry Wells, the Henry for the uncle who had stood with them from the beginning. And Henry Prout received this information at the kitchen table with a red face and a great deal of throat clearing that did not fully conceal what it was. With James in the cradle and Patrick on sturdy legs, and me conducting her various sovereignties, and Thomas developing into a capable and confident young hand, and Lily producing essays of improving quality that Mr. Crowder read with the expression of a man who has been given something to live up to. The Wells household was loud and full and organized with a cheerful, ordered competence that was thoroughly Theodora's work applied to thoroughly their shared life. It was a morning in late November, with the first real winter coming down from the canyon rim, that Milton walked out to the porch after breakfast and stood for a moment looking at the road. He thought about that October night 2 years ago, the impossible coincidence of the broken axle and the light in his window and the knock at midnight, the specific way that one moment had folded itself into the next and arrived here. Theodora came out behind him with her coat over her shoulders and her coffee in her hand, and stood beside him. The canyon below was wearing the first dusting of snow on its upper rim, and the morning light on it was clean and cold and magnificent. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "That night," he said. "The knock." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so frightened," she said. "Not of you, of everything. Of what it would mean if you opened the door and sent us away. I did not have a plan beyond your light." "I know," he said. "I saw your window from the road," she said. "I had me in my arms and Thomas holding my hand and Lily holding Thomas's, and the wagon was sitting in the ditch, and I thought, there is a light, and I walked toward it." He turned and looked at her in the November morning. His wife, 2 years of marriage in her face alongside everything that had preceded it. The Missouri girlhood and the Kansas marriage, and the 19 days of road, and the midnight porch, and the garnet brooch, and the parlor, and the church, and the first frost, and the mortgage receipt, and the baby and the lamplight, and the April morning, and all the ordinary days between and after and ahead. "I am glad you walked toward it," he said. She looked back at him with the full green of her eyes in the winter light. "So am I," she said, "more than I know how to say." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they stood together on the porch of their house on their land. And inside were their children and the warmth of the stove, and the smell of the breakfast they had just come from. And below them the canyon was white and gold in the morning, and the road ran east toward Red Rock and west into the territory, and there was snow on the canyon rim, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that belongs only to the Colorado high country in winter. Enormous and clear and without a single cloud, the land was theirs, the life was theirs. And whatever the road ahead held, they would meet it as they had met everything from the beginning, with practical honesty and full hearts, standing side by side in the light they had made together. Me appeared in the doorway behind them. "James is awake," she reported. "He is being loud about it." "I will come," Theodora said, but she did not move immediately. She looked at Milton for one more moment, her head against his shoulder, the cold morning on her face and the warmth of him beside her. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "I will be right in." She straightened, touched his hand once, and went inside. Through the window, he watched her cross to the cradle and lift James into her arms with the practiced ease of a woman who knows this motion in her bones. And the child's noise settled almost immediately into the simple, satisfied quiet of being held by the right person. Milton stood on the porch for another moment in the cold November air, looking at the road and the canyon and the sky, holding his coffee and his gratitude in equal measure. Somewhere in the barn, Ghost the cat was conducting its morning business. In the pasture, the cattle moved through the thin snow in the slow, meditative way of animals that have enough. Compass was visible at the fence, looking at the morning with the equanimity of a horse who has been reliable so long that equanimity has become his primary characteristic. It was a good life. It was the life that had been made from a broken wheel and a lit window, and a woman brave enough to knock on a stranger's door at midnight because her children were hungry, and she had no other choice, and she trusted that the world still contained people who would open the door. He went inside, into the warmth, into the sound of his family beginning its morning, and the door closed behind him against the November cold, and the house held everything it contained with the solid, ordinary, irreplaceable permanence of a home that has been built from the ground up by people who meant to stay. In the spring of 1876, when the wildflowers came back to the canyon country in their annual extravagance, Lily Wells, at 12 years old, wrote a letter to the school in Denver about enrollment the following year. She composed it at the writing box her stepfather had made, in the careful, clear hand she had developed under her own supervision, and she read it to her mother before sending it, and Theodora said it was excellent, and Milton read it and said it was better than excellent, and Lily accepted both assessments without false modesty because she had done her research, and it was in fact an excellent letter. Thomas, at 9, was by common consensus the best hand with horses in the Lower Canyon operation, a fact that Corey Dale acknowledged plainly in the manner of a man who does not offer compliments unless they are earned, and is satisfied when they are. Thomas received this acknowledgment with the same gravity with which he received everything, and then went back to work, which was the correct response. Me, who turned 7 that April, was engaged in a project she had been planning for 2 months, which was to teach Patrick to ride. Patrick, who was 2, had clear opinions about this and expressed them vigorously. The negotiations were ongoing. Me was confident of the outcome. James, at 8 months, was an entity of considerable personality for his compact size, with green eyes that had deepened to the full shade of his mother's, and a laugh that had charmed every person in the household, including Ghost the cat, which was generally charmed by nothing. And Theodora and Milton Wells, on an April evening with the spring sun on the canyon, sat on the porch of their free and clear house on their land in the Colorado Territory in 1876, and watched their children and their life and each other. And the world around them was red and gold, and enormous and full of the particular sweetness of a thing that was entirely, completely, permanently theirs. He took her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The canyon wind moved through the cottonwoods below, gentle this evening, nothing like the cold teeth of October, more like a conversation between the world and itself. Above the rim, the first star of the evening appeared, and then another, and the sky above the Colorado Canyon country deepened from gold to rose to the blue dark of the earliest evening, and the house behind them breathed with all the life inside it, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.